He was the true father of Jackson's Democratic Party, having organized it in the 1820s. And he was Andrew Jackson's hand-picked heir in 1836. This endorsement gave him the election. Number 8, Martin Van Buren, Democrat, 1837 to 1841. Age 54, from New York.
Van Buren was the ultimate political protege and the ultimate political machine politician. The skills he had as kind of a backroom political organizer were great at making him a builder of a political party, but did not serve him so well in terms of actually leading the nation as president.
Van Buren loved the good life, and I think in a way that he wanted to treat the White House as a kind of reward for a lifetime of hard work. Unfortunately, history didn't cooperate.
He got branded with a reputation that was almost entirely undeserved, and that is he got the reputation of being somebody who was a kind of wannabe aristocrat and was decorating the White House with gold-edged faucets and golden goblets and things, none of which was true. But Van Buren conducted himself in such ways that it seemed like it might be true.
He's seen as a man who is characterized, at least anyway, by his enemies, as an effete dandy. A man who perfumes his whiskers and who wears a corset. It's not the kind of image which is really going to work very well in the rough and tumble world of American politics of the 1830s and the 1840s.
When Van Buren took the oath, he certainly inherited the high hopes of Jackson's presidency. But he also inherited the financial ruins of Jackson's bank war.
No sooner is he inaugurated than the Panic of 1837 begins.
Van Buren got socked right off the bat with having to respond to an enormous crisis of unemployment, of bankruptcy, of economic depression in all its ways.
And it gets progressively worse as time goes on. In fact, there's another panic in 1839.
The one in 1839 was even worse. It was caused fundamentally by a glut in the cotton market. And of course, cotton production was the backbone of the American economy. So when the price of cotton collapsed, the American economy collapsed.
No president had ever had to deal with anything like this before. I don't know that any president would have been up to the job, but Van Buren certainly wasn't.
As a man who had spent his entire career straddling the fence on issues, Van Buren was incapable of making tough decisions, such as the annexation of Texas. He ducked that question, fearing it would inflame the brewing slavery issue. As for the ailing economy, he had no real plan.
By the time 1840 rolled around, the country was in such a deep depression that it would have been obvious to all observers that Van Buren was bound to lose, that the Whigs could have run anybody and beaten Van Buren, and if they had known that, the Whigs would have run Clay.
But instead of nominating Henry Clay for president, the new Whig Party chose William Henry Harrison because they believed he was the candidate who most resembled Andrew Jackson. Harrison had been a frontier general and an Indian fighter. But more importantly, he supported the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The election of 1840 was a flamboyant affair, the first presidential campaign to feature open public rallies, songs, and slogans.
They would roll out the cider barrel when Van Buren's people would start to speak, as well as the image of the log cabin, and with chants of, Van, Van, he's a used-up man. They called Van Buren Martin Van Ruin.
In contrast, William Henry Harrison was touted by his old war nickname, which he got while fighting Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Tippecanoe and Tyler too was the slogan. John Tyler, of course, was Harrison's running mate.
One of the great symbols of the campaign of 1840 is the log cabin. William Henry Harrison wasn't born in a log cabin, but nonetheless this becomes sort of the enduring symbol of that campaign. And another symbol that the Whigs manipulate very successfully is the image of the English coach that Martin Van Buren allegedly rides in. And the Harrison supporters like to sing, "In English coaches he's no rider, but he can fight and drink hard cider."
Harrison took his lumps from the Van Buren camp as well. More than anything, they attacked his age.
People accused him of being too old and of being a sort of phony Jackson, a phony general. They even called him a granny general.
But ultimately, it was the economy that decided the election. Number 9, William Henry Harrison, Whig, March 4th to April 4th, 1841, 68 years old, from Ohio.
Poor Harrison felt it necessary to give a very long and learned inaugural address, probably because in the campaign it had been suggested that he was a simple homespun guy. Harrison decided that as a president he needed a different image.
Contrary to his campaign image, Harrison was hardly a backcountry bumpkin. He was an aristocrat, had a college education, and was the only president to study medicine. In taking the oath of office, Harrison wanted to remind people of his true background and dispel any adverse thoughts about his age. So he gave the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours.
He insisted on speaking on a cold March day with no hat or overcoat, and somehow he caught a cold, and the cold turned to pneumonia. And in the end, the poor man died.
Just 31 days into his administration, William Henry Harrison became the first U.S. president to die in office. Vice President John Tyler was playing marbles at his home in Virginia when he learned of Harrison's death. He immediately went to Washington to assume the presidency. But there was no clear constitutional guideline for succession. That set the stage for another epic battle in American political history. After becoming president, John Tyler refused to name a vice president. He served his entire term without one. He was a Southern gentleman from the planter aristocracy with a rich background in politics. He'd served in the House of Representatives and the Senate, been governor of Virginia, and was a consummate Washington insider. He believed in states' rights and felt strongly, like Thomas Jefferson, that too much power had been vested in the federal government. And yet, also like Jefferson, he expanded that power once he became president. Number 10, John Tyler, Whig, 1841 to 1845, 51 years old, from Virginia.
One of the things that John Tyler's never really given enough credit for, I think, is the way he assumes all of the powers of the office upon Harrison's death. He gives an inaugural address 3 days after he takes the oath of office and essentially sends a message to members of the Whig Party and to the nation at large that he is in charge. And he proves that in the years that follow.
He was a thin man, delicate, blue eyes. He felt that Congress should make policy, and this gave many the impression of him being weak. And this was a great, great misconception.
John Tyler of Virginia turned out to be his own man with his own political agenda, which surprised everyone. This became apparent from the get-go when Tyler faced immediate challenges to his newfound authority. He was derisively called His Accidency or His Ascendancy. Many believed he was just an acting president until a new election could be called. Even the members of his cabinet, which was really Harrison's cabinet, tried to muzzle Tyler's claim to power. In their first meeting, Secretary of State Daniel Webster told Tyler how the cabinet would make all executive decisions by consensus. To that, Tyler responded by asking for their cooperation or their resignations. For the Whigs, this was devastating. Harrison had promised to push Whig bills through Congress, including a new charter for the Bank of the United States. But Tyler didn't share the Whig view.
What happens is really unprecedented, and I don't think it's ever happened since. The Whigs passed 2 laws authorizing a new national bank, and both of them were vetoed by President Tyler. After the second of these vetoes, the Whigs held a meeting at which they expelled President Tyler from their party. And from then on, Tyler was a man without a party.
Politically isolated in the White House, Tyler pressed the business of the nation, while imposing his will and skill as president.
One of the things that Tyler's not really given credit for is his foreign policy achievements. You have the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is really a historic treaty between the United States and Great Britain.
This treaty settled the disputed border between the United States and Canada, which was still a British possession.
You also have the annexation of Texas, which is very, very controversial.
Tyler took it upon himself to sign a treaty with the new Republic of Texas. But the treaty was immediately rejected by the Senate. That didn't stop Tyler. He cleverly asked for a joint resolution of Congress, and that passed. Unfortunately, it didn't improve Tyler's sagging political popularity.
I don't really think there was any chance for Tyler to win a second term. He certainly thought about it. I think he wanted it. But the Whigs would have nothing to do with him by 1844, and the Democrats just simply didn't trust him. So he gracefully bows out. It becomes clear that the Democrats have nominated an expansionist like James K. Polk.
In the fall of 1844, Americans elected a new president, a dark horse candidate whom nobody anticipated, but everybody embraced because he pledged to finish the work that Andrew Jackson had started. Number 11, James K. Polk, Democrat, 1845 to 1849, 49 years old, from Tennessee.
The best way to understand Polk is to understand Jackson. Polk saw himself as someone who was going to fulfill this Jacksonian doctrine. What would Jackson do? This is the mantra that Polk seems to repeat almost every day he's in office.
The Polk administration, in effect, bookends the age of Jackson. He came into office with ample Jacksonian credentials and then achieved a whole series of Jacksonian measures once he got in office.
In many ways, he's perhaps more of a Jacksonian than Jackson is. He believes very, very strongly in this idea of a level playing field for the American people.
I've said that Jackson and Polk were wedded at the hip and the head, and I think they were. I don't think if you and I sat down to dinner with the president of our choice, James K. Polk would come in the top 25. I think he was a great president, but that doesn't mean that he was a likable man. He also was quite a devious man.
In contrast to his personality, Polk was probably the most accessible president in U.S. history.
The White House, for all intents and purposes, in the 1840s is a community center for the rather small village of Washington. The Marine Corps Band plays on the White House lawn every Wednesday, and this is open to the public. Polk also makes himself available twice a week to American citizens, and all that was required was to knock on the White House door and to give your card to the steward and to wait your turn. Polk really does see himself as the first servant of the people.
Polk is often called the hardest working president in U.S. history. He was known for his long workdays and had gas lights installed in the White House so he could work through the night.
Polk was a hands-on micromanager as president. For example, he was the first president to really get deeply into the budget. He was the first president to tell all the heads of all the departments, look, don't send your budget requests straight to Congress. Send them to me.
More than anything, James K. Polk wanted to fulfill the ideological promise of Andrew Jackson's presidency, what was then being called America's manifest destiny.
He embodies it, this idea that the United States has a providential destiny to expand westward is something that he accepts implicitly.
To Polk, manifest destiny was more than an idea. It was his presidential mandate.
Polk had 4 goals, which he was dedicated to achieving in his 4 years as president. He said he would only serve 1 term. He wanted to settle the controversy between the United States and Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. He wanted to bring California into the United States. He wanted to set up an independent treasury to fix the credit mess that had prevailed since Jackson. And he wanted to lower tariffs on imports into the American economy.
To achieve his economic goals, Polk pressured Congress to lower the federal tariff and to establish an independent treasury. He succeeded. To achieve his territorial goals, he used force. First, he threatened war with Great Britain to gain the Oregon Territory.
The crowd was raised, 54-40 or fight, 54th parallel, 54-40 or fight. And to his credit, he did not draw the line in the sand on that, end up the 49th parallel.
Then he actually went to war with Mexico to settle the Texas border and acquire the Southwest and California. The Mexican War, fought between 1846 and 1848, came to dominate Polk's administration. And that, along with the acquisition of the Oregon Territory, became the legacy of his presidency.
People don't remember, I'm sorry to say, that Polk's greatness as a president has to do directly with the fact that in 4 years, he did take the country from just west of the Mississippi all the way to the Pacific Ocean. From sea to shining sea, a ringing phrase, Polk gave it to us. He made us a continental nation.
By the middle of the 19th century, it was apparent to many in Washington that America's founding fathers had left a legacy with 2 loopholes. A loose republic of states, perhaps divisible, with liberty and justice for some. In less than 75 years, the republic had grown from a colonial possession into a continental nation. Territory gained after the Mexican War stretched the country from sea to shining sea. Yet this new land threatened to divide the nation.
Most republics throughout the course of history had not survived. The Americans of the first half of the 19th century were uncertain whether their republic would survive a serious crisis, or would it break apart?
Tensions were rising between the North and the South. Each wanted to settle the West in its own distinct image.
The North is far more populous, far more economically developed than the South, but it has not exercised real political power in the nation. The South has had a stranglehold on the Democratic Party, on the presidency, on the Supreme Court.
The nation was at a crossroads. The power struggle between North and South was escalating into a crisis that demanded an extraordinary president. As it turned out, Zachary Taylor was not that man. Number 12, Zachary Taylor, Whig, 1849 to 1850, 64 years old, from Louisiana. Zachary Taylor was a celebrity, a Mexican war hero who'd helped to win over 500,000 square miles of new land for the nation. He was also a political unknown.
Zachary Taylor was someone who was not seeking the presidency. Both parties came to him and wanted him to be their candidate.
As a war hero, he appealed to the North. As a Louisiana landowner and slaveholder, he appealed to the South. He had no obvious agenda, but in the end, he would surprise them all.
There's something about Zachary Taylor. If I had to pick out a prototypical pre-Civil War American, I certainly would pick Old Rough and Ready.
Taylor's nom de guerre, Old Rough and Ready, was as much a tribute to his fighting spirit as it was for his slovenly appearance. He had none of the polish of a professional politician and was not a great communicator. Taylor had never registered to vote and didn't even vote in his own election. Despite outward appearances, he was really a Washington insider. His Army position had been arranged by his second cousin, James Madison. Robert E. Lee was his fourth cousin once removed, and Jefferson Davis had been his son-in-law. As president, Taylor deferred to others, going so far as to declare he would not exercise his veto power.
Taylor didn't really see the presidency as a very powerful office, and he was actually strongly influenced by members of his cabinet and by certain members of Congress.
He did say that he believed that the slavery issue should be decided by Congress, and Congress would be the ruling body, and that he would go along with whatever Congress proposed.
The slavery debate was beginning to get ugly. The fragile peace between North and South, established 30 years earlier by the Missouri Compromise, was starting to crumble.
Well, when Zachary Taylor came into office, the country was facing a serious crisis over the question of the expansion of slavery into new Western territory.
On one side, Southern extremists were threatening secession if Congress didn't rule in their favor. On the other side, the clamor of Northern abolitionists was growing louder. In response, Senator Henry Clay created the Compromise of 1850, a bundle of bills designed to link the admission of California as a free state with some slavery measures favorable to the South.
So this was a kind of package that Clay put before the Congress, giving some concessions to the slave states and some concessions to the free states, which he hoped would go through and satisfy everybody.
But the compromise didn't satisfy some people, including President Taylor.
Taylor surprised a lot of people. He thought there was something to compromise about. He said, look, California should be admitted as a free state, and that's it.
Taking back his promise, Taylor threatened to veto the compromise.
Taylor insisted on going ahead, even at the risk of provoking Southern state secession.
Taylor's solution for the secessionists was somewhat simplistic.
I'll hang him. And I might start with my son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who was a senator from Mississippi at that time.
I think his best moment was simply affirming the integrity of the nation in response to threats of disunion that were coming from the South as the controversy over the Compromise of 1850 intensified.
Barely a year into his administration, Taylor was evolving into an ardent Unionist. On a hot 4th of July in 1850, Taylor took a break from the political infighting to preside over a groundbreaking ceremony for the Washington Monument. Scorched by the summer sun, Taylor sought relief with a pitcher of milk and a bowl of cherries. Within hours, he complained of severe stomach pains.
There are people who were proposing that he was actually poisoned by arsenic, that there was this conspiracy to get rid of him.
Taylor died 5 days later. Most believed he succumbed to gastroenteritis, an inflammation of the intestines. But there were lingering suspicions of foul play. It would take more than a century before anyone would know for certain. In 1991, an historian convinced Taylor's descendants to allow his body to be exhumed. Forensic analysis revealed no signs of foul play. Instead, they determined that a form of cholera was the most likely cause of Taylor's death.
As far as I'm concerned, he definitively was not poisoned with arson.
Where Taylor might have taken the country is a mystery. But it would soon move in an entirely different direction when Taylor's vice president assumed the presidency. Number 13, Millard Filmore, Whig, 1850 to 1853, 50 years old, from New York. Unlucky number 13, Millard Filmore was an accidental president. Some have called him the Gerald Ford of his day. Considered so unremarkable, a Millard Filmore Society used to gather annually at his gravesite to lampoon his forgotten presidency.
He was a rather strong president, considering the fact that he was an accidental president, and those presidents always have a difficult time establishing their mark.
Millard Filmore hadn't even met Zachary Taylor until after they were elected. Seen as Taylor's opposite, Filmore was picked merely to balance the ticket geographically and politically. Filmore was a Northerner, an affable man who was always dressed impeccably. He was a bookworm and a hands-off manager. He aimed to please and appease rather than lead.
He was a kind of colorless character who believed in compromise, who deferred to congressional leadership.
According to most observers, bland, friendly, willing to make you feel that you had said something important, and just generally fitting in.
And yet, behind this amiable personality lurked a man with backbone. Bitter at feeling overlooked by Taylor's cabinet, Filmore fired all of them. Filmore continued to exert his newfound power by reversing the policy of his predecessor and signing the Compromise of 1850 into law.
Filmore said, no, I'm in now and I'm going to change the government's policy. Taylor was all wrong about the Compromise of 1850.
Filmore supported slavery because he believed its abolition would lead to a collapse of the Southern economy.
60% of U.S. exports came out of the cotton states by 1860. So to abolish slavery was to abolish an economic system.
Filmore also believed that slavery was protected by the Constitution, and that by signing the Compromise, he would somehow put the issue to rest forever. What he failed to grasp were the moral consequences, and he blamed abolitionists for making slavery an issue.
He was totally opposed to the abolitionists. He thought they were troublemakers, fanatics.
Filmore was content with the Compromise because he thought it would preserve the status quo. For some, however, it only served to strengthen their resolve against slavery. By supporting the Compromise, Filmore hoped to please everyone, but instead he ended up pleasing no one, including members of his own party. In the election of 1852, the Whigs wouldn't renominate him. So Filmore went home to Buffalo, leaving behind one of the most forgettable presidencies in American history. 12 presidents were generals before being elected: Washington, Jackson, Harrison, Taylor, Pierce, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Ben Harrison, and Eisenhower. It was 1852, and the tenuous strands of the Compromise of 1850 were barely holding the nation together. Franklin Pierce appeared to be the perfect feel-good candidate. He was a Northern Democrat with strong ties to the South. Voters in both regions thought Pierce would bring balance and peace to the nation.
He was known by everybody, everybody knew him, everybody liked him. That's how he got nominated to begin with. There wasn't anybody who didn't like him.
Number 14, Franklin Pierce, Democrat, 1853 to 1857, 48 years old, from New Hampshire. Franklin Pierce was practically handed the presidency because he was offensive to no one. He would leave office reviled by all.
Pierce had terrible timing throughout his life. Even his timing of when he got elected president was poor. Everybody called him Handsome Frank. The word that was used often in describing was elegant. Extremely outgoing, very charismatic. Even people who didn't like him felt he was a wonderfully charming, interesting person.
Pierce Pierce was well known as a man about town, a social and political butterfly of sorts with a penchant for drinking, often to excess.
Being involved in politics meant being in taverns, meant slapping people on the back, buying them a drink, and the drinking culture in America at this time was enormous. I mean, one scholar called it the alcoholic republic.
Whether he was an alcoholic is hard to judge today, but he probably was. There were times in his life, however, when he did not drink and when alcohol did not seem to play an important role in his life, and that includes the time he was president.
By all accounts, Pierce managed to stay sober during his presidency. But some believe he was not emotionally stable because of a terrible personal tragedy he suffered just weeks after his election. Pierce, his wife Jane, and their son Benny were in a train wreck. Pierce and his wife were unscathed, but their 11-year-old son was killed.
The top of his head had literally been taken off. Right in front of his parents, Franklin Pierce grabbed his cloak and threw it over Benny's body, hoping that Jane wouldn't see it, but she did, of course, and that was a terrible tragedy to them.
Pierce and his wife had already lost 2 other children to disease. Benny was their last surviving child.
To have your remaining son, the light of your life, Benny, killed in front of your eyes in a train accident, who could imagine the horror that that would instill in anyone?
Added to Pierce's troubles was the death of his vice president, William Rufus King, 6 weeks after the inauguration. And things were about to get worse. Early in 1854, Pierce received a visit from members of his own party, including Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas informed Pierce he was sponsoring a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act is one of the key moments in all of American political history.
The act was designed to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which banned slavery in states above the southern border of Missouri. The intent was to let the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska, both north of the boundary, decide for themselves if they wanted slavery or not. Douglas promised to make Pierce's presidency a living nightmare if Pierce didn't support the scheme.
The president should have said, no, you're opening a can of worms, a hornet's nest. But no, Pierce is weak, Pierce can be bullied, and Douglas forces him basically to say, okay, the administration will support this.
And so Pierce basically caved into them. And as a consequence, most of the Northern Democrats in the Senate and exactly half of the Northern Democrats in the House supported the bill, and that was just enough to get it through Congress.
Anti-slavery groups in the North just went berserk over this bill. They went ballistic.
Among the outraged was a little-known politician from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was so angered by the blatant pro-slavery act that he helped create a radical new political party to oppose the expansion of slavery, the Republican Party.
Previously, he talked about slavery now and then, but basically he'd just been a fairly ordinary Whig politician. The Kansas-Nebraska Act brings Lincoln back into politics, and it brings him into politics as a spokesman against the expansion of slavery. It galvanizes Lincoln.
Meanwhile, in the Kansas Territory, anti- and pro-slavery settlers were literally fighting it out. On May 21st, 1856, pro-slavery forces burned the abolitionist stronghold of Lawrence, Kansas, down to the ground.
The whole political situation begins to disintegrate, and Pierce is completely incapable of putting it back together again.
Pierce failed to see his role in the deterioration of the Union. He genuinely thought he had a shot at a second term, but even his own party rejected him. Pierce returned home to New Hampshire, his reputation ruined. Several years later, after his wife Jane died, he returned to heavy drinking and lived his remaining years as a recluse, perhaps the saddest legacy of any president.
Presidents are, what can I say, they're victims of whatever happens both during and after their terms. So I think Pierce's reputation will not recuperate anytime soon.
But as tragic as Pierce's presidency had been, it would pale in comparison to his successors. Number 15, James Buchanan, Democrat, 1857 to 1861, 65 years old, from Pennsylvania.
James Buchanan is often ranked at or near the bottom in these polls to determine the best and the worst of the American presidents. I think the reason that he's often rated near or at the bottom is because actions that he took during his presidency probably hastened the coming of the Civil War.
He did fail, but I think he failed with integrity, and I think he needs to be given credit for at least trying.
I think that he should be maligned, but we've got to get it right. Really, what he deserves his last place rating for is near treason.
James Buchanan was one of the most politically accomplished presidents America has ever had. He had been a congressman, foreign minister, senator, and secretary of state. What he'd achieved in life was due to hard work and a fastidious nature. He would stay up late at night to attend to the smallest of details. Buchanan was different in another way. He never married and is often referred to as America's only bachelor president.
There are folks in the United States who say that James Buchanan is our first homosexual president.
The allegation arose from the intimate friendship he had shared with Franklin Pierce's vice president, William Rufus King, a man he had lived with for 16 years.
There really is not a lot of hard evidence. There are 3 or 4 mentions at the time of Buchanan and his wife, or Aunt Nancy. These 2 men are Aunt Nancy's. Now, King was part of this circle of dandies, they called them, and there certainly was some sense in this group of men that they were having homosexual relations.
It's very hard to make any kind of determination about something like that, even about someone living today, let alone someone living in the 1850s.
Buchanan had his charming niece, Harriet Lane, serve as his White House hostess. Since Harriet wasn't Buchanan's wife, she was called the First Lady, a term coined to describe her role. While Harriet presided over social life at the White House, Buchanan presided over a house rapidly dividing. His decision to endorse the Constitution written by the pro-slavery settlers in Kansas made Buchanan appear to be a supporter of the South and a traitor to the North.
The idea that the president will try to force slavery into a territory where it's clear that a majority of the settlers don't want it completely discredits his administration in the eyes of large numbers of Northerners, including Northern Democrats, not just Republicans.
Everything that James Buchanan does for the last part of his administration is so pro-Southern that he does not do, in the classic presidential oath, preserve and defend and protect the United States.
Ultimately, Buchanan's management of the battle in Kansas did nothing to settle the slavery issue. It only made it worse. Slavery, couched in the mantra of states' rights, was now the defining issue in the historic election of 1860. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. It was now only a matter of months before the South would lose its ally in the White House. In anticipation of an anti-slavery president, South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. As a lame duck president, James Buchanan denied the legality of secession, but didn't do anything to stop it.
Was he being weak at that moment and indecisive? Probably. Was he scared to death? Certainly. Did he have a sense that this was an incredibly dangerous moment? Definitely.
Within weeks, 6 more states left the Union, and 8 slaveholding states sat on the fence, becoming border states. On February 9, 1861, the Confederate States of America, now composed of 7 states, elected Jefferson Davis as their new president. 1 month later, Buchanan's presidency came to an end.
He was tremendously relieved to set aside the burden of office and hand it over to Lincoln.
On his last day, Buchanan said to Lincoln, "If you are as happy to be entering the presidency as I am to be leaving it, then you are a very happy man." Unknown to America at the time, James Buchanan had quietly purchased several slaves and sent them north, granting them their freedom.